Before 1935, there was no federal safety net. If you grew old or became disabled, your survival depended entirely on where you lived. And in the rugged mountains of Appalachia, survival meant relying on a system built out of absolute necessity. Because the terrain was so difficult to navigate, with poor dirt roads and long, treacherous distances between neighbors, collecting enough tax revenue to fund a large, centralized care facility simply wasn't an option. Instead, these communities relied on a practice called outdoor relief. Rather than sending people away to an institution, local county courts would draw up contracts, paying private citizens a small stipend to board destitute neighbors in their own homes. This localized approach stood in sharp contrast to the rest of the country. Northern states and lowland cities were constructing sprawling brick almshouses to warehouse hundreds of the poor and highly regimented bureaucracies. Appalachia's physical isolation kept its safety net intimate and decentralized, forcing the region to rely on tightly knit kinship networks far longer than surrounding states. But as populations eventually grew, boarding people out was no longer enough. County courts were forced to centralize care by purchasing tracts of land, often exceeding 100 acres, to establish dedicated county poor farms. But these were not sterile institutional buildings. A typical mountain poor farm was remarkably modest, usually consisting of a main farmhouse, a few wooden outbuildings, along with tillable soil and pasture. To run the property, the county hired a superintendent. He and his family lived on site, managing the daily agricultural operations alongside the residents. Even with a centralized location, the setup mirrored a large household. It operated as a localized agrarian safety net, intended strictly as a last resort for neighbors who had exhausted every other option. The original residents of these farms, referred to in official records as inmates, were mostly the elderly, individuals with physical or intellectual disabilities, and orphan children who lacked any family ties in the area. The system required everyone to earn their keep if they were physically able. Able-bodied residents were assigned specific daily chores, from cutting timber and tending livestock to spinning yarn and cooking. For the significant portion of residents who were entirely unable to work, the farm provided them with basic communal living quarters and shared subsistence-level meals, subsidized by the labor of the others. When those residents passed away without family to claim them, they were buried in unmarked graves in small, county-maintained cemeteries, often located on a hill overlooking the farm. This entire ecosystem functioned on a razor-thin margin. It was carefully balanced around agricultural self-sufficiency, designed specifically to care for a very vulnerable and relatively stable local demographic. That delicate balance shattered with the arrival of heavy industry. As railroads, large-scale timber operations, and coal mining expanded aggressively into the mountains, they brought about a sudden demographic shift. These operations drew tens of thousands of new workers into company towns. Many were migrants arriving with no local kinship networks to rely on, and the labor they performed was incredibly dangerous. When these men were severely injured or killed on the job, the companies they worked for offered virtually no financial protection or compensation. As a result, permanently disabled laborers, along with widows and orphans left behind by industrial accidents, were funneled directly into the only safety net available, the local poor farm. By refusing to care for their own injured workers, these sprawling industrial corporations dumped the massive human and financial cost of their expansion squarely onto the shoulders of rural county governments. Over time, county budgets buckled. They were now attempting to support both their traditional vulnerable populations and a rapidly growing wave of industrial casualties. This animated chart shows how the system broke. The ratio of working to non-working residents inverted. With medical costs rising steeply, agricultural self-sufficiency became impossible. Looking at this timeline, the expanding red zone shows the deficit widening rapidly, draining local resources relentlessly, until the mid-1930s. Relief finally arrived in 1935, when the federal government intervened by passing the Social Security Act. By creating a national pension system and providing federal funds for the elderly and disabled, this single piece of legislation transferred the financial burden away from the counties, rendering the poor farm model entirely obsolete. With the residents supported by federal checks, counties no longer needed to maintain hundreds of acres of agricultural property. Over the next few decades, the land was leased out, demolished, or sold off entirely. Because these were large, pre-cleared tracts of publicly owned land, they were perfectly positioned for mid-20th century infrastructure projects like new interstates and toll roads. Across the country, county fairgrounds, public hospitals, and emergency service stations were built directly over the former fields and unmarked graveyards of the poor farms. Today, the physical structures of these localized agrarian safety nets have been almost completely erased from the modern landscape. While the poor farms themselves have vanished beneath layers of asphalt, their difficult history remains a crucial bridge, marking the harsh transition from intimate, neighbor-based charity to the modern federal welfare system we rely on today.
Thanks for watching. Please join us again next time for more history from the mountains. Don't forget to like and subscribe,